The daughter of Attorney General Merrick Garland has been tapped to clerk for Justice Kagan. The news blew up on Twitter. Friend of the show, Glenn Greenwald, called the choice, quote, a bizarre one. She'll often have to recuse herself from working, end quote. In response to the clear nepotism, our next guest tweeted, quote, a black friend of mine from a poor southern state was denied a federal district court clerkship on the grounds that his uncle was a magistrate judge on the court, end quote.
Joining us now to discuss is former National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, contributing editor at Current Affairs, and co-host of the Bad Faith podcast, Briahna Joy Gray. Briahna, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And so, Briahna, the Supreme Court released a statement saying Jessica Garland was hired in July of 2020 before her father's appointment, and in light of the potential conflicts of interest, she will not serve as a law clerk while Attorney General Garland remains in office. But I thought the point that you made was completely fascinating. The idea that a candidate could be ruled out because they had family that were already in positions of power would be a shock to our entire way of hiring. You know, as I've navigated this more elite world of Washington, if I come across a last name that I've heard of, I automatically assume, until proven otherwise, that they are related to the person I'm thinking they are, and I'm very, very rarely proven wrong on that. What did you make of that discrepancy between how your friend was treated and how everyone else is treated?
Well, first, I'm glad to hear that, the recusal issue is curbed somewhat by the fact that she won't be serving as a Supreme Court clerk while her father tops the Justice Department. And, moreover, the news that she was hired a couple of years in advance of Joe Biden winning the presidency and any knowledge that her father was going to be in that position, helps clarify how something that has such a glaring veneer of impropriety was able to happen. So that's news that came out a little later in the day yesterday, and that clarification was welcome. But I think we're all familiar with the idea that there are nepotism rules in place at a number of institutions that seem not to have the same workarounds for folks who aren't quite so connected. So, I was met with, I heard of the news of Jessica Garland from my friend who, texted the chat chain of kind of lawyer friends that I'm on, saying, gosh, this is unfortunate. Nothing like this was worked out for me. But I think it's none of us are any stranger to the idea that, people who are elites tend to get workarounds. We have an ongoing news story about, Joe Biden's son and his art selling, his gallery work. We obviously just went through the whole Trump administration with instance after instance of nepotism. So I think the real story here in some ways is just that when you're coming from a family of immense power and privilege, opportunities present themselves to you. Sometimes you're qualified for them, sometimes you're not. It's a mixed bag, but it can be frustrating when we're living in a world with such enormous inequality across the board to see people continue to get opportunities that aren't available to all.
Briahna, I'm wondering if you can talk about how this specifically works in big law, because we often see this disparity between, elite law schools and sort of, run-of-the-mill law schools, and those graduates sort of get into a pipeline, and that pipeline opens doors for them. It, gives them the best paying jobs, and those lawyers then go on to serve, the elites in other areas of society. So I think this is true on both the left and the right. The right has federal society for this. The left probably has something equivalent, but I'm wondering if you can talk about this specific to the legal profession.
Well, first I'll say, unfortunately, the left doesn't have anything equivalent to the Federalist Society. There is an organization called ACS, the American Constitutional Society, but even it doesn't hold itself out as an ideological project in the way that FedSoc kind of boldly does. I did an interview with them a few years ago for an article I ended up not finishing because I left The Intercept to join the Bernie campaign. But in the course of that interview, I talked to someone from ACS, and they kind of resisted the idea that they were a direct counterpoint to FedSoc in quite that way, which for those who would like there to be a more aggressive pushback to FedSoc and the influence in the courts is a little bit disappointing news. But I think that your broader point is correct, that it is very difficult to leapfrog over the kind of platform that an elite education gives you. When you look at the history of where people who have served on the Supreme Court went to law school, it's almost exclusively Harvard and Yale, with maybe a smattering of Princeton if they're feeling, benevolent. And the clerks are much the same way. Jessica Garland is also joining the ranks of those whose clerks whose parents also clerked for the Supreme Court. And so it's difficult to ignore that the people who are making the highest judicial decisions in our country are from a very, very narrow class band of the populace, a very narrow elite educational band of the populace, and they're weighing in on decisions that often are much more grassroots and much closer to the experiences of Americans that are very, very different from them. And this is an issue that we tackled on a recent episode of Bad Faith, where we talked about not just the political nature of the judiciary, but the fact that it has historically been very anti-democratic in the way that it's handed down cases. And there is an enormous amount, not just the cultural issues that we tend to talk about left, right with the Supreme Court, but there is an enormous extent to which the overwhelming thrust of 5-4 decisions in a conservative direction are upholding a corporate elite and oligarchy here in this country, and that's what we should be keeping our eye on the ball on.
And can you unpack that statistic that you talked about a little bit, where there are a ton of clerks whose parents also clerked on the Supreme Court. That clerking on the Supreme Court is an awfully rare thing, and so if this were distributed kind of randomly across the population based on pure merit, you would not land on so many children of former clerks getting jobs. Is it the same among Democrats and Republicans? And have you noticed this, like, as you've kind of moved through the legal world?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure. I happen to have one friend from college who did clerk on the Supreme Court for a conservative justice, and he is not a nepotism type. He's kind of a first generation, Italian American, family. So that's difficult to say. But what I will say is that I hear people having conversations a lot about how, not just how unequal an Ivy League education and elite education sets people up to be, which is very, very true. But sometimes a kind of dismissiveness about how, that doesn't even matter. These schools don't matter. Going to those schools don't matter. And I also want to caution people not to be sufficiently deferential to the authority and privilege that you actually do get from these institutions. They should be aware of it so that they know exactly how much they're being disadvantaged by not having access to those institutions, right? So even within a school, even if you do go to one of these institutions, it is enormously competitive to get a Supreme Court clerkship. You have to do multiple other elite clerkships before you even get to that point. You have to have, incredible letters of recommendation and a stellar academic record. And you also have to kind of be able, have a sense that this is what you want to do coming into the gate. Someone like me who kind of fell on happenstance into law school, not really realizing what she wanted out of her career. By the time I would have figured it out, I already hadn't taken the classes necessary. I already hadn't kind of doubled down and gotten the grades that were necessary. And as a consequence of getting a Supreme Court clerkship or any kind of prestigious clerkship, an appellate court clerkship, also, there are enormous signing bonuses that you get, incredible career opportunities, and on down the line. So these institutions really do concretize a kind of class inequity in this country. And that's not to say, no Supreme Court clerkships. I mean, there's a conversation to be had about whether we should have a very different Supreme Court or Supreme Court at all. And we had that on our podcast. But to say that it should not be, I think, as acceptable as it is in our society, that not only all the Supreme Court justices themselves come from such a narrow band of our educational infrastructure, but that their clerks do as well.
So real quick, Briahna, before we let you go, one more question. When you think about this elite entrenchment in the legal profession, how much of it is the legal profession doing it to itself? Because I'm not an attorney, but I live in D.C. You throw a rock and you hit an attorney. So I've been observing, all of the sort of continuing legal education and, the ABA and, all these things that you continue to have to do. It's sort of elites selecting elites to overcome, these continuous hurdles. And, it's interesting, Matt Stoller had a Substack that talked about, the sort of country lawyer that used to run the DOJ antitrust division back in the 1930s, and we don't see that anymore, right? It's sort of elite selecting elite. So how much of this is a self-perpetuating cycle by the legal profession itself that it would have to change?
There's so much about the law is that kind of artifice that creates a false sense of exclusivity that then gives lawyers the privilege to have exclusive domain and to charge a lot of money for what they do. So, we talked about this on that same recent episode where, legal code is written confusingly so that someone has to inscribe it. We're often dealing with issues that are extremely relatable, these common law issues, contract disputes, that it certainly doesn't take any special language to be able to interpret. These are commonsensical judgments that are being made. Most of the time that something goes to court, that actually goes to trial, it's because it's something that is a close issue of fact oftentimes, not something that requires a lot of kind of legal intellectualizing, except to the extent that the law is designed in that way, right? And all of the credentialing and bar requirements are also to make the profession sufficiently exclusive so that lawyers can demand money for doing this service. And there's an incredible stat that something like only 8% of people, regular working class, middle class people, ever are able to avail themselves of legal counsel because of how expensive it is. And of course, we know that we have a right to counsel in the criminal context, but so much of what happens to us in our everyday life are these civil claims that ordinary people never challenge because it's not worth it to bring your landlord-tenant case to trial, for instance. And so as we strive for equality, states that have started to have a right to attorney for tenants and other kinds of interventions of the like are doing a great deal to equalize the playing field for ordinary people. And that is some sliver of optimism on the horizon.
Great. Well, Briahna Joy Gray, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course.
Coming up, Tara Reid and Joy Button discuss the Medicare for All marches taking place across the nation this weekend when Rising returns.